the majority, if you look at the whole organization of various members, that a small percentage actually fulfill that obligation. Does anyone have any idea what that might be?
100% of them.
I don't know if that's an obligation tag. Well, I heard recruiting, and that's really the correct answer. Of all the obligations we all accept when we join the club, one of the most important and one of the ones that most Rotarians
Oh man.
Right? What the heck?
remember.
Hi, Howard.
I think it's you and me.
Thus, in every club, there are many Rotarians who readily accept the pleasures of being a Rotarian without ever sharing that privilege with another person. It's up to every club member to reach out to prospective members and invite them to join us. Have you ever accepted your obligation to share Rotary? That's just a rhetorical question at this point. The procedures are simple, and everyone must know at least one person who should belong. So go out there and help share Rotary Club.
So I apologize to those of you who are online for apparently sending the wrong link. But you're here. Sherry's back from Vancouver. And Sherry,
Literally, we got
like you're
in
awake.
at 2
Good for you.
2 a.m.
2 a.m.
2
Okay, everybody.
a.m.
She sets the bar high. Good job, Sherry. So
I'd be
Sherry,
there-
I will ask
I'd be
you
there
to
in
go,
person, but my alarm didn't go off.
and you're here anyway.
I am.
Yeah. Good job. So Sherry, I will ask you to introduce our speaker.
Yeah, so Ethan, thank you so much. So Ethan Tapper, as I think almost probably everyone there knows, is our Chittenden County Forester for the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation. Ethan advises private landowners, municipalities, conservation organizations, foresters, and loggers on responsible stewardship for forest lands. He administers Vermont's use value appraisal program in the county. He manages over 4,000 acres of community forests. He writes for a monthly column for 11 community newspapers. That's why I see you everywhere. And a quarterly column in Northern Woodlands magazine. He maintains a YouTube channel, leads dozens of public events attended by thousands of people each year, and manages his own 175-acre forest called Bear Island in Bolton. Ethan's a 2020 recipient of Vermont's Covert's James B. Engel Award, the Northeast Midwest State Foresters Alliance 2021 CFM Forester Award of the Year, the 2021 recipient of the American Tree Farms Systems Education and Outreach Award, and the recipient of 2022's the 2022 recipient of the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program's Vermont Tree Steward Award. Sorry, Ethan, if I mess that up reading right now, I'm just like, woohoo. My eyes are kind of a blur. But man, thank you so much for joining, and everybody here's Ethan.
All right. And Sherry, do you still want me to wrap up by 8:10?
That would be up to Sally in the room there.
What do you think, Sally?
We can't hear you, Sally.
Can't hear you.
So Ethan, if you can speak for about 20 minutes and give us 10 minutes for questions, I'm pretty sure there's going to be a lot of questions.
Woof. Okay. This is going to be Okay, so I'm gonna do a reorganization of this talk on the fly because I was planning for 40, but this is gonna be great. I'm gonna zoom through it. So it's now 7:43. You want me to be done at like 8:05?
Sure.
Okay, I'm gonna do my best. How about that? All right, I'm gonna share my screen and away we're gonna go. It's gonna let me. That's weird. Oh, here we go. Okay. Whoa. Okay. So I call this presentation Forestry for a Change in a Changing World. Basically what this is going to be, and this is going to be like lightning round version of just a little bit about forestry and some of the issues that we're facing in the world today, and sort of, you know, how we can think about our relationship to forests in this moment in time. So one of the first things that I always challenge anybody to do in one of these talks, or if we're out walking in your woodlot or whatever, is to sort of reimagine what a forest is. So when we think about what is a forest, most people are like, yeah, I know what a forest is. I've been in them. It's a place with a lot of trees, right? It's this, you know, if you look up on the internet what a definition is, it's like place with trees is a forest. And I really think about it in a much more holistic way, you know, and so forests are, this is a better definition probably of what a forest is. This is a definition from the book Wetland, Woodland, Wildland, which is an amazing book about Vermont's natural communities by Liz Thompson and Eric Sorensen, new edition also by Bob Zano. And they define a natural community as, quote, an interacting assemblage of organisms, their physical environment, and the natural processes that affect them. So a forest is more than just trees. It is a living community that is engaged in a dynamic process, and it includes other things besides trees. So it's this moving, changing, dynamic thing, which is really this massive volume of life. And I think probably a better analogy for how to think about forests is that the trees in a forest are like the coral in a coral reef. So they are this living structure around which this community is built. But if we're thinking about a coral reef, we would never just think about the coral, right? Like the coral is the only thing that matters. We would think about this entire living community that's woven around it. And that's really how I think about trees. Yes, trees are big and they're charismatic and they're really important, but they are certainly not the only thing that matters in a forest. And they're not the only thing that helps a forest function. One of our challenges in managing and protecting healthy forests is that a lot of us have a really unrealistic expectation about what forests are supposed to be like. For whatever reason, each of us has this ingrained idea of healthy forests that look like this, that look like a park, that have big, evenly spaced trees and this clear, open understory. Unfortunately, this forest, which makes us feel really comfortable and happy, and we're like, wow, this is so great, I love being in here, has nothing to do with what a healthy forest actually is, or any of the really important functions or habitats that they offer. Healthy forests really look like this. They are incredibly messy, they are dynamic, they are changing all the time. Tree mortality and death is a really important part of them. And one thing that I've learned in my work with people is that an understanding of like the benefits of this forest, of this messy, complex, dynamic ecosystem as it's supposed to be, is not something that any of us are born with. It's something that we need to develop actively. And so if that previous slide looks to you more like what a forest should look like, and this one looks all kinds of wrong, that's normal. And it's just something that we all deal with. The qualities that we really look for in healthy forests are these qualities of diversity and complexity. So diversity, when I'm talking about diversity, it's sort of lots of different kinds of things, lots of different species of trees, lots of different species of animals, lots of different ages and types of forests, and also complexity. So complexity is sort of all those different things, all those different kinds of diversity layered on top of one another. And so, you see a picture here, this forest is complex, which means that it's experienced some disturbance, it's regenerated, it has all different sizes and ages of trees, it has gaps in the canopy, it has deadwood on the ground, it has many different species of trees. All of those things are linked to increased climate resilience, improved diversified wildlife habitat, improved ability of the forest to sequester and store carbon, just in general, forests which are more adaptive and rich with life. And this process of diversification and complexification is completely natural. It's something that happens to forests naturally as they age, and as they experience mortality, they tend to become more diverse and more complex. When we manage forests now, we think less about, we sort of have, again, another kind of human prejudice to want to manage these systems to be stable and to resist change. Like, we want to manage, you have these trees in our forest and we really like them and they're beautiful and we want to protect them, right? So we want to manage that forest to be stable. But really, if we're thinking about it, if we're reimagining forests and how they work, and reimagining these processes, the change that is so important to the way that forests function, instead, it makes more sense to manage them to be resilient. So we know that they're gonna change. We know that they have to change. We know that change is good. It's things like mortality and natural disturbances are actually really positive. And so what we need to manage forests for is resilience, for the ability to maintain their health and their natural processes throughout great stress and change, rather than trying to resist that change. Excuse me. And we also need to manage them to be adaptive. So we don't totally know what the future is going to hold for our forests in the world that we live in. And so it's really, really, really important that we provide a lot of different pathways for trees, species, and also plants, and also animals to adapt and to change to suit these sort of ongoing challenges of this moment. There's a lot of interesting things about forests that I could pull out. One thing that's really captivated a lot of people is this idea of the wood wide web, right? So forests, we've known for a long time that forests have mutualistic associations with fungi. So there are fungi in the soil, these fungal threads, hyphae, that connect to trees, and they help trees uptake nutrients and water. And then the trees in return, they're generating all these sugars from the process of photosynthesis in their leaves. Fungi can't photosynthesize, so the trees are passing a tithe of those nutrients back to the fungi. What has become more known in recent years is the idea that these fungal networks actually connect different species of trees, and they have all these interesting adaptive qualities where trees can actually like share resources and subsidize each other. It's really, really interesting. These relationships were famously written about, although unfortunately pretty inaccurately, in the book The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Wohlhaben, which is probably the most famous book about trees ever written, and is for most foresters and ecologists completely unreadable. Shots fired at Peter Wohlhaben. What is true is that these networks are really important, that they're completely fascinating, but also that they're really resilient. So like in that book, The Hidden Life of Trees, the author is talking about trees just like holding on to, trying to survive and resisting change, and that anything that you could do to like harm a tree would in some way damage this network. And what's really true is that, again, natural disturbances are a part of how forests have evolved for thousands of years, and these mycorrhizal networks, which are also a part of how forests have evolved for thousands of years, are really resilient. And a tree dying absolutely does not damage it in any way. There is a real temptation, again, going back to this unrealistic assumption that we have about forests and how they work and what they're supposed to look like. There's a temptation to mythologize forests as these like utopian systems and to anthropomorphize trees, such as in that book that I just mentioned, especially when we learn about those connections, right? About the wood wide web and the way that trees maybe are altruistic and the way that they're sharing. But I think if we mythologize forests and if we try to make them seem like people, we miss a lot of the most important lessons that they have to teach us, which is that these are systems that are incredibly messy and incredibly imperfect. They are engaged in this never-ending process. There's no endpoint, and they're complicated, you know, just like our communities, right? So in the forest, there are all these really cool sharing and caring things that are happening, and at the same time, trees are dying, things are parasitizing each other, killing each other, eating each other, destroying each other's habitats. Those same fungal networks can be used to pass harmful chemicals between trees. Forests are complex, you know, and that's sort of the really neat thing about them. So anytime we're talking about forests, we need to talk about legacy. And so legacy is a biological term. It means like the pieces of previous generations of trees or forests that exist in a younger or newer forest. But it also means the history on our landscape. And we have this incredibly altered landscape. And so anytime we talk about forests, we really need to talk about history. In the 1800s and 1900s, there was a change on our landscape of a massive scale. So we had probably been in Vermont 95% forested, and within 50 years became only about 20% forested. So what this means is that any forest you've ever walked in probably was at some point in the 1800s was a field, and many of them were maintained as such for a century or more. Most of the forests in Vermont are now very young, 60 to 100 years old. The main driver of this landscape clearing was, of course, European colonization, but then also specifically the drive to create sheep habitat. There was all this really interesting interactions with like Napoleon invading Spain, and then the special merino sheep, which wasn't allowed to be exported from Spain, was exported to this guy, William Jarvis, who was the United States consul to Portugal, to his farm in Wethersfield. And it was this sheep capable of producing this really amazing wool. That happened in like 1810, and by 1837, there were 1 to 1.7 million merino sheep in Vermont. So this was a really, really massive impact on our landscapes, and it's just incredible to walk in the woods now and to see some of these areas that you could never imagine could be a pasture, and then of course you come upon a stone wall. This also had this land clearing and also European colonization had this massive effect on wildlife. So for instance, prior to this clearing, the main ungulates, herbivores, large herbivores on our landscape in Vermont were caribou, moose, and a species of elk, which is now extinct, called eastern elk, forest-dwelling elk. There were many species, you know, those species were extirpated from Vermont, and as were many others in the 1700s and 1800s. So in Vermont, during this time period of this massive land clearing, we extirpated all the beaver, all the turkey, all the fisher, all the moose, caribou, elk, catamount, wolves, bear, deer, otter, Canada geese, passenger pigeons, which were at one time very predominant in the state. And so, you know, and I'll talk about in a second how some of those were sort of reintroduced or allowed to recolonize Vermont later. But there's just some really amazing things as we try to piece together what Vermont looked like even a few hundred years ago. One really amazing example of this is with respect to beavers. So prior to European settlement, it was estimated that there were as many as 300 million, or I'm sorry, there were as many as 300 beaver dams per square mile in Vermont. So that's about a square mile, 640 acres. That's a beaver dam every 2 acres. Massive, massive, massive impact. And they were completely wiped out in the state, really by the early 1700s. By the mid 1670s, about 250,000 beaver pelts had been shipped to Europe from the Connecticut River Valley alone. Really interesting to think about how that altered our landscape. Some species were reintroduced. So beaver were reintroduced in the 20s. White-tailed deer, which were actually historically limited to these really tiny populations in the Champlain Valley, the Connecticut River Valley, they were reintroduced in 1878. Fisher, turkey, beaver, and marten were also reintroduced in the 20th century. There's all these really interesting examples of the way that altering these wildlife species dynamics really changed things in Vermont, but just for the sake of time, I'm not going to mention them right now. One thing I would also say is that in addition to losing some species, we've also gained some species, some good, some bad. Coyotes, first seen in Vermont in the 1940s, sort of moving into that empty apex predator niche. Virginia possums now moving to the state. Red foxes, probably European, not native. Earthworms, mostly European and Asian. No native earthworms in Vermont, and they're actually really harmful in our forests. house sparrows, starlings, pigeons. There's a bunch of other species that are non-native that have sort of now naturalized in our ecosystems. I'd always learned that about 80% of Vermont was cleared for pasture. That sort of seems like the thing we learned in school, but it wasn't all just pasture that was leading to the clearance of our forest. Forest exploitation also played a really major role. So you got to think about in the 1800s, normal home, this is pre-wood stove, a normal home was using like 40 to 60 cords of wood a year. And by the 1800s, in the mid 1800s, the trains and steamboats were all still using wood. They were using like 7 million cords annually by 1870. Railroad ties for the railroads were also a major user of wood. They were using about 30 million cords a year just for repairs, not even to build new section of roads, which, to take it into context, that's the timber from about 150,000 acres just for railroad tie repairs. Iron production was still using wood. And so in Vermont, you know, there were these pastures, but then there are also forests that were being really intensively exploited and clear cut on short rotations, sometimes on 30 rotations for stuff like charcoal. And so the legacy that we're left with is, in Vermont, we have younger forests. We don't have as many big trees. We also don't have as much diversity and complexity in our forests. So old growth forests are not just big trees. They're actually mix of different sizes and ages of trees and those qualities that we talked about, diversity and complexity. We also, across our landscapes, lack a balance of different types of forest, as we would have seen a few hundred years ago. We've also really altered the tree species composition. So for instance, prior to European colonization, Chittenden County beech, American beech, was by far the most common tree species in our county, comprising 40 to 60% of all the trees in the county, probably. And now it's about 3 to 5%, which is also, there's a non-native disease called beech bark disease, which has an impact with that. And obviously we've lost different wildlife species. We've had new ones come in. So we have this altered wildlife species dynamics as well. So when we think about the way that our landscape is changing, a lot of times we just think about climate change, but really the way we need to think about it is in terms of global change. So global change is climate change plus all of these other human-caused stressors. So all of those things I just talked about in the landscape are incredibly altered forests, are incredibly altered wildlife dynamics, in addition to stuff like invasive exotic plants, animals, insects, pests, pathogens, forest loss, deforestation, conversion to other uses, forest fragmentation, pollution, and all of these other things which collectively comprise sort of the volume of the threats that are facing our ecosystems. We also need to recognize that we're in this crazy time. We call it the Anthropocene. So it's a geologic epoch, which is defined by human influencing every ecosystem on Earth, and in many ways being the predominant influence on our ecosystems. And this mass extinction event, which we are in the midst of, the 6th such event that we know of, but the first which is attributable to an individual species. And we're losing a lot of biodiversity, and biodiversity is really important to our ecosystems. One of the most incredible facts is that global animal populations have declined by about 68% since 1970. So what that means is that there are about a third of the animals on the planet, we think, that there were 50 years ago. It's a massive impact. We think that there's about 1 million animal and plant species that are now threatened with extinction, which includes 40% of amphibians, a third of reef-forming corals, a third of marine mammals. We have lost, we think, about 700 species, vertebrate species that we know of, and probably around 100,000 or more invertebrates. 100,000 more species of invertebrates. Biodiversity is really important. I was sort of inspired to think about this by the biologist E.O. Wilson, who's just a real inspiration to many of us in the natural resources community. Biodiversity, I think about it as the currency of our ecosystems. It's what makes ecosystems work. It's what makes them resilient. It's what makes them beautiful. It's what makes them, you know, all of these species are not just cool because they're cool. They're also a part of the way that these ecosystems function. And we can define biological diversity, which is shortened to, so biological diversity has been shortened to say, to create the word biodiversity, as the variation between species, the variation between different ecosystems, and even the variation with genetics between different species. I'm sorry, the genetics within a species. So different genetic populations of the same species. one of the biggest threats we face here in Vermont and elsewhere is deforestation. Deforestation is really scary because it is permanent. An area that has been cut, that was a forest that has been cleared and converted into a different use will never be a forest again, at least not within any sort of time frame that we can conceptualize. Globally, we've lost about 30% of our forests. As of 2020, we're losing about 13 million acres a year. In Vermont, we're losing thousands of acres a year, somewhere between 1,500 acres and about 13,000 acres a year. And ecosystem loss, deforestation is the single largest threat to biodiversity globally. And avoided deforestation is one of the biggest carbon gains that we can make in terms of helping our ecosystems sequester and store carbon, and also mitigate the effects of climate change and slow down climate change. So here we are, right? We live in this highly altered landscapes with extinctions or invasives. We often wonder what would happen if we continue to pull pieces of our ecosystems apart. At what point would they begin to break down? And the truth is that we're already there, and that we've already lost these important species and habitats. We already live in a changed climate, and we're already off the map. And so one of the things that I do is I believe that we don't have the luxury of inaction at this moment. It's tempting to be like, well, we've done all this horrible stuff to our forests or ecosystems. We need to step back and remove ourselves from them. And I think that is exactly the opposite of what we need to do. I think we need to be able to do what's necessary to protect them, and also to help them adapt and to be resilient. That's what the forestry that I practice is all about. So a lot of what I think about is not how do we sort of remove ourselves from this relationship with our ecosystems, but how do we step into that relationship? How do we form a relationship that is positive in a holistic sense as we chart a course for a better future? And I think it's important to acknowledge that even if we were to be like, what, we're stepping back, we don't want any, we're just going to let ecosystems do their thing, and we're going to be in our own little human world. That's not a real choice that we actually have. The question is not if we want to have an impact on our ecosystems. The question is, what do we want that impact to be? Because everything we do, everything we consume, everything we wear, every little piece of energy that we use is made of something. And those things, they have impacts on ecosystems and on people globally. And so it just is, I think it's really important that we stop thinking about whether or not we should impact our ecosystems, and start thinking about, you start framing it as we know we have an impact. What do we want that impact to be? And it's also important to recognize that this is a quote from this amazing book, Pulitzer Prize winning book, The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Kolbert. Having freed ourselves from the constraints of evolution, humans nevertheless remain dependent on the Earth's biological and geochemical systems. So as much as we're a bunch of smarty pants and able to completely alter this world that we live in, we remain completely dependent on ecosystems for everything that we consume, for the air that we breathe and the water that we drink in this really delicate climate that we live in. All right, it's been 22 minutes. I'm going to charge through 3 more slides, and then we can talk more about it. I would also add, so with responsibility, we need to think about, in this changed world, what do we owe to our forests and other ecosystems? What do we owe to each other? We already have the tools to solve these problems. We do. And we just need to generate the willpower to do so. So part of the work that I do is, sort of thinking about what is this positive relationship that we can have with our ecosystems. And I do it through forest management, as odd as it seems, through the cutting of trees, and trying to sort of help our forests recover from these massive changes of the past and this incredibly altered landscape that we live in, and actually help them in many cases to develop more of the qualities that we'd associate with old growth forests, which we know to be these really rich environments, centuries sooner than those qualities would naturally appear. So as much as we want to just sort of leave all our forests alone, our ecosystems and our biodiversity cannot wait 300 years for those qualities to develop. And so in addition to leaving some areas unmanaged to develop those qualities naturally, I also use forest management as a tool to do that at the same time that we generate local renewable resources. Type of forestry I practice is called ecological forestry. And the idea is that we're managing forests like they manage themselves. We're managing forests, sort of using the forest management to generate these simulation natural disturbances, and at the same time having that reimagined idea of what a forest is. So we're not doing right by a forest unless we're managing not just for the trees, but also for that entire living community that's part of the forests. And really trying to stress those qualities of diversity and complexity. What does this look like? Anybody in the world, except maybe a forester and ecologist, would walk into any forest that I manage and be absolutely horrified, because it is a mess. And I make it that way on purpose, because we're trying to create forests that are diverse and that are complex, and that's how we do it. Using logging as a tool, we're managing for many different sizes and ages of trees. We're leaving lots of dead wood on the ground, just like would be on the ground after a natural disturbance. We're not cutting every big tree. We're leaving lots of big old legacy trees that just get to remain in the forest forever, and creating small pockets of different habitats that are important across the landscape. And the last thing I'll say is, at the same time, we need to recognize that we need to address these massive biodiversity threats. Things like white-tailed deer, massive, continent-wide, huge biodiversity threat, as a result largely of predator extirpation and other things. Invasive exotic plants like buckthorn, honeysuckle, multiflora rose, oriental bittersweet, the list goes on, really throw a wrench in our forest's ability to regenerate and to respond to disturbances, respond to climate change, all these other things. And of course, forest loss, deforestation is one of the biggest ones. Woof, okay. There's a lot more to say, but that's all I can do in 20 minutes. So I would love to talk more about any of these things and to address your questions.
Thank you.
I can't hear you, but I see people's hands clapping, so thank you.
So I'm going to take advantage of my spot at the podium. Howard, you're next. The first couple of slides you showed gave me an embarrassing moment of history. 40 years ago, when my husband and I moved into our house, which is on about 1.5 acres, I wanted at least half of which is forested. I had this notion that I wanted this pretty English forest.
Yeah.
So my husband called up the then UVM Extension Service, and we had a forester come out. And of course, he said what you said. I think today you would love my forest. It is a mess. There are trees down, but the birds are there, the bugs are there, the deer come through. So I'm really happy that we did what we did. So my question to you is, do you do consultations with people who have forested land?
Yeah, so I wanted to get right to the presentation, so I didn't give my whole rundown of what it is, what my job actually is. So it consists of basically 4 parts, and the county forester program was established in the 40s primarily as a means to help private landowners manage their forested lands. In Vermont, we're 75%-ish forested, and about 80% of those lands are owned by private landowners. And so we basically outsource the management of these ecosystems, which are incredibly important to our economy and to our collective ecology and to all of these scenic beauty, all of these really important parts of being Vermonters and stitching our world together. We've outsourced those to people, private landowners who don't necessarily have any knowledge of how to manage an ecosystem. So that's what the county foresters do, is to help give those people the tools to manage forests better. And we do that. I do that in basically 4 ways. The first is that I manage that program, the current use program. Its official name is the Use Value Appraisal Program. That's a big chunk of my time, big chunk of all county foresters' time. The second thing is, if you own a piece of forested land, you can just call me up, and I'm just a free resource for you. We'll just go take a walk and we'll talk about what's going on and what opportunities there might be for management if you want to do that, or just what is the deal with your forest, and we'll take a walk together and we'll talk about it. And yeah, and then the other parts, just to finish that thought, I also manage those community forests that Sherry mentioned, about 4,500 acres, about a dozen community forests, town forests, and I do a lot of demonstration work. And so I've done a lot of that at the Catamount Community Forest in Williston, and we'll have more projects coming up, especially next year. The Heinsberg Town Forest, the Andrews Community Forest in Richmond, and others. And then the 4th part is doing all this other stuff, writing articles and talking to you guys and doing whatever whatever is sort of going to address that question, answer that question of how do we improve the quality of forest management in our county and the health of forests. So one thing I would say, you know, and to your original question, or your original point, is that everybody wants to clean up their forest. It's just something that we all want to do, and we have this like innate sense of that we should do it. There actually is some really interesting research about it from E.O. Wilson, this biologist, he made me aware of it in one of his books, The Future of Life, I believe, where he talks about, there's all these studies about that the environment in which a human being feels comfortable in is probably the closest to an African savanna. And there may be actually an evolutionary basis for that. So that's an environment where our species evolved for tens of millions of years. And like any other biological species, we have instincts to gravitate towards our habitat. So that's why E.O. Wilson thinks that we do that. But anyway, so yeah, people call me up and they're like, they just got this piece of forest land and there's like, you know, they look at it and there's trees on the ground and stuff. And they're like, oh my God, we got to clean this up. This is bad, you know? And then I go out there and it's my job to be like, this is really exciting, you know, or after like a big windstorm, you know, and they're like, oh my God, this is a disaster. My forest is dead. And I'm like, this is the best, you know. You just really learn to celebrate the messiness once you get into it.
Yeah, and my husband's very happy because it was a lot less work than he thought he was going to have to do.
Yeah.
So
you know,
Howard, you have a question?
go ahead.
Go
Howard.
ahead. Howard, you're muted. There you go.
There we go. Hi, Ethan. Thank you for speaking to us today. You would like my property. We've had some microbursts and there's a healthy lot of material on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Your range of understanding of the natural world is impressive. I've seen some of your writings in the Richmond paper and some of the stuff you've done. We're very lucky to have someone like you in our midst, and appreciate the work you do. And you seem very productive and happy in your current position. I'm curious what someone like you sees yourself doing over the coming 10, 20, 30 years, because you're a pretty sharp fella and have a broad range of capacities and possibilities to be a little bit of a Mark Trail in our world.
Boy, that's so nice. I have no idea. I mean, I know that. So when I got this job 6 years ago, and a lot of the county forest, you know, it's not a job that, you know, like a person of my age at that time normally gets. And I didn't think I was going to get it. I don't know, ended up getting it. But a lot of them, it's a job that foresters come to later in their careers. And it's like, you know, they become the county forester and they just do this for 30 or 40 years, you know, and it's neat to think about. You know, one thing that's really interesting is I just really value, you know, the more time I spend with this job and the more people I get to meet and the more forest I get to explore. It's like you have this like big map of this county and you're like filling it in. You know, you're drawing it in with these people and these forests and this amazing history and natural history. And it just feels, you know, it's constantly like enriching my experience of this place. And so that, you know, I definitely really like that. You know, there's something that's very attractive about just doing this, you know, forever. But, you know, who knows? I mean, it's 10, 20 years, a long time. I'll tell you one thing. So the county forester, Bill Hall, who is the county forester for 30 something years, I think from 65 through 97. A lot of people around here know Bill Hall. He was an Olympic bobsledder as well. I believe he was actually buried in a bobsled. And so I keep on threatening that I'm going to go leave to join the bobsled team.
He was the guy that came to our house.
Yeah.
And he said an interesting thing. He, you know, we had been talking about cutting down some trees and he pointed out 2 saplings and he said, see those 2 saplings, they're about the same size. He said, one of those may be growing really well and one of them not. but
Yeah.
you can't tell by looking at them. So if you cut down the wrong one, the other one's not going to grow. I never thought of that until he said that. It
Yeah,
was,
managing forests is complex, you know, sort of the easiest, conceptually, the easiest way to think about a forest is in terms of like a plantation, you know, where you have like all these trees, they're all planted on the same day and they're all the same species, you know, and so they grow up and then you're like, okay, I can see which ones are the healthiest because they're the biggest, you know, and I can see which ones are the least healthy because they're the smallest. But, you know, we're managing forests with about 60 native tree species and they all have different growth rates. And so there are occasions when you can have a tree that, you know, like many of our old fields, we have these white pine is like one of the most common tree species of Vermont, primarily just because it's good at growing in these old fields. And it's growing on these sites where it's actually not very well suited at all. It just is there because it's good at growing in pastures, you know, and we have such an incredible abundance of these abandoned pastures that have reverted to forest in the last 60 to 100 years. And so you can have, for instance, white pine, which is just there because it's an old field and white pine's good at growing in old fields, you know, which is massive. And then you can have a sugar maple right next to it, which is the same age, but is, you know, a white pine, maybe it's 20 inches in diameter, the sugar maple's 6 inches in diameter. They're exactly the same age. And in that case, you might want to cut the white pine to release that sugar maple, which the sugar maple is, you know, actually well suited to that site, and it's going to be a part of your forest for 200, 300 years. So this is one of the reasons why it's really important to if you own forested land or if you manage forested land, to really spend the time to understand like what the different species are and some of the complexities there, and or to avail yourself of the resources like myself or a consulting forester to understand, you know, a nuanced approach to manage your forest, because it's not always intuitive.
great. Thank you so much, Ethan. Sherry, I'll let you ask a question and then you'll be the end of it.
Oh, you muted.
You're still muted, Sherry.
There we go. Sorry about that. So I haven't done the Zoom thing in a while. Trying to get away from it. So we have some land and we consider ourselves stewards of the land. And it is interesting. I think of poplar trees is kind of being a pain because they get so tall so fast, they fall, but they'll take out our maple trees and they'll take out trees, you know, that you want to try to keep. But and then I was surprised to hear that earthworms are not good.
Not in the forest, no.
Oh, because it's just funny. We always think that with our gardens, of course, we think, oh, earthworms, our soil's good, but
Yeah.
not in the forest.
No, they're actually, so in some of our forests, like I just wrote a management plan for the Miltontown Forest, massive earthworm problems. And what they do is they actually digest leaf litter and organic material too quickly. And so what forests really need is they need this layer of decomposing leaf litter, which species like sugar maple actually root into that layer, not into the soil itself. And where there's earthworms, they just digest that material too quickly. And then you can end up with these forests that have just like bare soil. And that can be an erosion concern. And it can also prevent certain species from colonizing. And also where earthworms tend to have they work together with deer to really lower our biodiversity in some cases and minimize the species that can regenerate in our forests.
Well, I learned something new.
There you go. Yeah, and so
I learned a lot of new stuff.
before you take it away, I just want to put in a couple of plugs. So I do have that YouTube channel, which there are videos on that channel. If you just go on YouTube and you search for Chittenden County Forester, there's like so much more that I wish I could have said. This is like an hour-long presentation, but there are videos on all of those things, including webinar recordings of like full-length presentations on that YouTube channel, and information about other stuff like treating non-native invasive plants, which is a big deal in Williston. Knowing what those plants are, identifying them, and then also being able to treat them. You can also go to, I have a link tree. So if you go to Linktree and search for Chittenden County Forester, you can find actually a list of all these different things. You can find an archive of my monthly articles. You can subscribe to the YouTube channel. You can sign up for my email list, and you can check out some other projects that I've been involved with, forest management plans, stuff like that. So yeah, if you're interested, avail yourself of some of those resources.
Will do.
Made them for you guys. So
We definitely will do that. We have 87 acres, so we manage it. We try to manage it by not managing it, or you sort of not manage it by, anyway. So
yeah, we should take a walk out there, and anybody out there who has, you know, a piece of forested land, maybe not like a quarter acre, but you know, who has any from a few acres to like 87 acres like Sherry, feel free to give me a call and we'll schedule a time. We'll take a walk and we'll talk about it.
sounds great. Thank you, Ethan. So as a token of our appreciation for your time and expertise today, we're going to make a donation in your honor to the Connecting Youth Mentoring Program at the Williston Central School.
Yay.
So yeah, and thank you so much. Sorry for the little mix up there at the beginning, and I wish we could have given you an hour or two. I think we'd all be intrigued.
Well, yeah, sign up for that email list and you'll know if you want to hear more, you'll know where to find me.
There we go.
Great. Thank you so much, Ethan.
Thank
We're going to
you.
conduct a little business. You're welcome to stay or have a great day otherwise.
Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So I just have a few business things. I'm going to run through it very fast, so pay attention, okay? Because I'm not going to repeat it. The first one is a question came up about whether we want to charge for people who just want to have a cup of coffee. And the answer is no, but you're welcome to give us a donation if you want to. We're looking for website sponsors, $120 for a year, and we have room for 4. So if you have a business you'd like to advertise, speak to Jeannie. The question came up about board minutes, whether we should post them on the website. My question is, of the people in this room, if we posted the board minutes, how many of you, be honest, would read them? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, we'll decide if that's enough to post them. We'll let you know. Or we can email them to you. I'll talk to Phil about what would be easier for him. Front post for forum posts. We have been doing posts. We're going to do more regular posts of speakers as well as seeking members and sharing our website. So you'll see us on Front Porch Forum. Next week, the district governor is coming. I'm going to give her a heads up because RI is hot to get all clubs on Facebook. And we have already made a conscious decision in this club not to do Facebook because of its politics. I'm going to warn her because she's probably going to come with a lot of exciting stuff about Facebook. And I don't want her to be disappointed. The last thing is, again, show of hands. We're going to have a blood drive at the end of September. The first question is, how many of you know what your blood type is? Perfect. Okay, next show of hands. How many of you will sign up to give blood? Come on.
I would, but I'm ineligible.
Okay, we're not judging, okay? But we're gonna need, our speaker September 1st is from the Red Cross. He's gonna tell us how many we have to carry out the blood drive. So even if you aren't giving blood, please talk to your friends and your family and get people to sign up so we can make it happen. Colchester Milton Rotary is having a blood drive on September 15th. Do not give blood at their drive. And don't tell them I said that, okay? Because you won't be eligible 2 weeks later. Okay, now it's Sergeant at Arms time. Marty?